All right, so welcome. And just as a reminder, last week we saw the lead up to the Second World War. You looked at some things between the wars, some of the anxieties that were there, and we saw some of these things in a podcast. I gave some notes on 7.5 about independence movements, how they became more intense between the years. And you have to look at the Great Depression. You have to look at the rise of Hitler and fascism in the context of the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, governments became involved in their economies much more with the New Deal. And you need to know Stalin's 5-year program, and that was dealt with in the podcast last week. And the things that led up to World War II, which were basically very similar to the things that led to the First World War. So in terms of the battles of World War II and everything, you don't really need to know an encyclopedic knowledge of that at all. Just like with World War I, you needed to know that there are new weapons and there were high casualties. And the weapons are pretty easy to name if you watch the movie Shell Shocked, or the documentary Shell Shocked, and the battles such as the Battle of the Somme. And it's the same thing for World War II. You don't need to know all the little battles and everything, but you do need to know some characteristics, general characteristics of the war. It's much more important to understand the effects of the war, because this is just huge in shaping what the world will be like after 1945. So the hallmark of World War I mentioned with the high casualties and so forth, but in World War I, civilians really weren't targeted by the opposite army. World War II, that completely breaks down. And to get that across to you, I posted a video called Civilians at War, and it's in the same series that we've seen some other things from, the ABC News series called The Century. And this one, I usually don't just give you a documentary to watch in its entirety. I've looked at little bits and pieces, but this one called Civilians at War, it's an hour long, but it's the breakdown of the war. It's just a very interesting video, and you need to know from the war the basic theaters. You need to know the atrocities committed in the war, and you're all familiar with the Holocaust, of course. And this video deals with that, and it's kind of, it's not a pretty topic. But in the same way, most students don't know what happened in Asia with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, invasion of China. You have some similar things driven by another racial ideology, just like the Nazis had a racial ideology. And there were new weapons, of course, and the atom bomb. That's all in this video. And so if you would watch Civilians at War, that would kind of complete the stuff from or the ideas, the content that we started last week that leads to the Second World War. Now, after the World War, the two big topics of this week that will spill over into next week are different but very much related topics, and they are the Cold War and decolonization. Now, in terms of decolonization, let's look at this cycle that we've seen. After 1492, after Columbus, there was this incredible imperialistic colonization time where all the Americas were colonized by the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British and so forth. And then in the 1750 time period, 1776, those areas got independence. But also in that period, 1750 to 1900, a new wave of imperialism came. I call this imperialism version 2.0. And this is the scramble for Africa, the British taking of India after the Sepoy Rebellion, what's known as the Raj. And it's also the falling of China, so to speak, after the Opium Wars, where major nations get a zone of influence in China. This second wave of imperialism is based on the needs of industrial nations. They needed raw materials and markets. Well, that comes to an end after World War II. So the great scramble that really happened in many places becomes unscrambled after World War II. And it's simply because the nations that took all those colonies were so damaged by the war they could no longer hold on to them. So decolonization is a huge deal here. It starts almost immediately after the war in 1947. India gets independence, but then splits into India and Pakistan in 1947. And this process of independence leads up to about 1980, where Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, gets its independence. So you have this process from 1947 to 1980 of this rapid independence. 90 new nations are created in the world. And in almost all of Eurasia, 90 new countries were created. However, the creation of these new countries and that decolonization takes place in the context of this emerging thing called the Cold War, which I know you've heard about before. The Cold War was a non-direct conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So to put this in context, the U.S. and the Soviets were very unlikely partners in World War II, but we had one thing in common. The desire to destroy fascism in Hitler. Hitler and Stalin at the beginning of World War II were allies, but Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union, as you'll see in the video Civilians at War, because the temptation was too great. He wanted all that land, and it had the largest population of Jews, and he hated communism. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is really what destroyed Nazi Germany, and they blasted the Nazi regime out of existence in April 1945. And the U.S. landed on the beaches of France, and the U.S. came in from the west, and the Soviets came in from the east, and occupied both halves of Berlin, and then the war ended. The war in Europe ended. It would be later in August when the atom bombs would end the war against Japan. But here the U.S. and the Soviets, friends during World War II. But that little marriage of necessity between the U.S. and the Soviets would end the moment Hitler was defeated. Suddenly we're no longer friends. And matter of fact, the U.S. gave aid to the Soviets. This aid was called Lend-Lease. Roosevelt started the Lend-Lease program, where ships full of military aid and food and warm clothing were sent to the Soviet Union to help the Russians in their struggle against Germany. But the moment the U.S. found out that Hitler was dead, the ships that were in the middle of the ocean sending aid were called back. They turned around. It was over. The friendship between the U.S. was over. And that's because of this. The U.S. and the Soviets both had very different plans about how they wanted the world to be rebuilt after this total destruction of the Second World War. And obviously the U.S. Wanted to bring democratic institutions, and the U.S. wanted to set up trading partners, nations with whom they could conduct free trade in an open market. The Soviet Union wanted to spread their revolution, their idea of communism that was against the wealthy landowners and those who owned the private means of production, and they wanted to have a revolution from below and create communism. Those two things can't happen together. So also after World War II, they were the two strongest powers left, remaining. They were the two powers that were standing. France and Britain. France was taken by Germany. Britain was weakened so badly. It was two powers in the world. And the Cold War is the indirect struggle between the U.S. and the Soviets to recreate the world, each in their own image. And with all these new countries, think about decolonization, with all these new countries forming, the U.S. and the Soviets are rushing in there, knocking on the door, so to speak, trying to make these new countries that are former colonies like them. And the U.S. and Russians never fought directly. They came close. The Cold War led to these insane moments that could have led to a World War III. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion. There are other times when the U.S. and the Soviets were on the verge of war against each other. But no American soldier fired a shot at a Russian soldier or vice versa. But the U.S. and the Soviets fought proxy wars. And that's a war where the U.S. was supporting a group in a country that was fighting a group that was supported by the Soviets. So we had allies within all these countries. If you think of the Korean War, for example, the U.S. was aiding, the UN actually, that was fighting for the South, and the Soviets and the Chinese were aiding the North. So this is what the struggle was. The Russian advantage was they still had a massive amount of manpower, and to defeat Germany, the Russian army moved across all of Eastern Europe into Germany. And when the war was over, they weren't walking away from that land. And Russian soldiers spilt their blood taking that land. And so they were there and they weren't leaving. Say they had direct occupation of Eastern Europe, and that would fall into the communist fold, the Soviet fold. The U.S. had enormous wealth. Its industrial capacity had not been hurt at all by the war. Not a single bullet grazed a U.S. factory, where all across Europe factories were obliterated by bombing of each other's, by bombing of the enemy. The U.S. had an enormous amount of aid, of wealth, and the U.S. would almost dangle that wealth in front of some countries with some strings attached, that if you took this wealth to rebuild, you would have to let the U.S. kind of influence you. The U.S. passed the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, passed through Congress, allocated billions of dollars that was given to other nations to rebuild after World War II. But when countries took that money, the U.S. would have influence there. So the U.S. used this aid to help rebuild nations and really make trading partners out of them. Remember, this is what Wilson wanted to do after World War I, rebuild Germany, rebuild these countries, and then trade with them. And we had the idea that then we would never fight them again. So the U.S. used the Marshall Plan. The Soviets very quickly got nuclear weapons. 1949 was a crucial year in the Cold War. 1949. This is because of two developments. First of all, after the war, the U.S. had used the atom bomb on 2 civilian targets in Japan. We're the only nation in the world to have it. By 1949, the Soviets had developed the atom bomb, and that was a terrifying thing for Americans. It was kind of nice when you're the only person in the neighborhood with a gun, but now the Soviets did too. So the Soviets got the atom bomb in 1949, and also in 1949, the largest, the most populated country in the world went with the communist side. China, in 1949, became, in the U.S. we say it fell into communism, but they would say they won the Civil War. It depends on your perspective. By the way, China, you specifically need to know some things about China in here. They're Great Leap Forward, and I have notes just on China after World War II that I'm posting. That's just exactly what you, it's 1 page. You have it, just a good summary with details about what you should know about China. So 1949 was a crucial year, and then in the early 50s, the Russians launched Sputnik, the first satellite. They were the first into space. And really the space race between NASA and the Soviets wasn't really to get the first man on the moon, which the U.S. did in 1969, but it was to show each other up. Rockets were being developed to deliver nuclear weapons, so you didn't have to fly an airplane over a target. You could just send a rocket, and ICBMs, International Continental Ballistic Missiles, could go around the world and take each other out. And this is a culture of fear during the Cold War. So that's important to know, that the context in which all of this takes place. There are also new institutions created. After World War I, Wilson wanted to create the League of Nations. And of course it was created, but the U.S. never joined it. The Russians weren't allowed in. The League of Nations was a failure because it had no force. It had no authority to enforce its decisions. It couldn't stop World War II. Japan was a member of the League of Nations, and it invaded China, and the League of Nations said, "Get out of there," and Japan just ignored it, withdrew, and there was nothing that could be done. After World War II, they decided to create the United Nations. It was the League of Nations version 2.0. So the UN was created, and the UN was created, and the U.S. never joined the original League of Nations, but the U.S., almost as an apology, I guess, decided to host the UN. The UN International Headquarters is in New York City, and the U.S. pays a large portion of its budget. The UN is to bring nations together to negotiate and use diplomacy and hopefully end war. And there's a committee in the UN made up of Britain, France, the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, called the Security Council. And these 5 members those 5 nations are permanent members of the Security Council, and they have veto power, each of them. That's so the UN can't be used in the Cold War. Russia would veto it. And if the Soviets tried to use the UN for their Cold War means to spread communism, the U.S. would veto that. So you have and the Security Council can authorize the use of force as well. So it fixes that problem with the League of Nations. So you have this new organization called the UN. And the UN has done some good things in the world. They are the ones who brought the Cuban Missile Crisis to the end. They've been in a lot of places doing things in the world. But like every human institution, they're prone to corruption as well. But the UN, as you know, is still with us today. So you have the United Nations. Other institutions that formed in the wake of World War I, the U.S. and its side of the Cold War began to form a military alliance. This sounds eerily like pre-World War I. We have the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance that would become the two sides. Well, the U.S. started the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, something called NATO. And NATO is a military alliance. Every member of NATO is pledged to defend any other member that's attacked. So Britain's in NATO. If a Soviet or communist nation were to attack Britain, by treaty, every other member of NATO would be required to go to the aid of Britain. So the U.S. created this military alliance called NATO. Well, of course, the Soviet Union responded. And in Warsaw, Poland, they began the Warsaw Pact. So this Warsaw, the name of the city, capital of Poland, the Warsaw Pact is a pact of nations. It does the exact same thing. And the Soviet Union used this to create this umbrella of protection for its satellite nations as well. So much of Eastern Europe, the communist areas in the world were part of Warsaw. And Warsaw and NATO, they upped the ante after World War II. It meant that, again, a war between any one nation in one side and any one nation in the other would draw all of them in, and the nuclear capacity of, or the power of nuclear weapons was demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they had been developed even greater after that. And then you had the hydrogen bomb and bombs that were much more powerful. So there was this terrible prospect of war in the 1960s and 1970s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. This moment, this feeling that the world could actually end, and that wasn't just some crazy end of the world hysteria. It was true. The world could have actually ended, and this is the culture of the Cold War. So new alliances between the wars. You have the UN, you have NATO, and Warsaw. By the way, Warsaw does not exist anymore. We'll get to the fall of the Cold War and the Soviet Union next week. Warsaw does not exist anymore, but NATO does, which makes Russians wonder why, but that's for another week. Anyway, so this is the basic nature of the Cold War, and some examples of places where the U.S. and the Soviets were trying, or the communists were trying to influence areas, and I'm going to show a portion of a video on this next week. Indochina was a French colony, and France could hardly hold on to it. This is in Southeast Asia. France could hardly hold on to it after the Second World War. They tried. The problem with giving Indochina its independence was the leader of the independence movement. It was Ho Chi Minh, and he was an adamant communist. So the U.S. during this time period looked at the world through the goggles of the Cold War, could only see two things: the forces of good and the forces of evil. All right? Our side of the Cold War and the other side of the Cold War. And here's an independence movement. You would think that the U.S. would be for that because that's what gave birth to us. But U.S. could not side with those who wanted independence because the leader was a communist. So it was a kind of a conflict of beliefs here. But our fear of communism was stronger than our desire to see people get independence from empires. So the U.S. funded the French, and when they could no longer afford it. Then we began to send troops. And finally, the French withdrew and the U.S. moved in, and Congress never declared war, but we were there 20 years in what is known as the Vietnam conflict. The U.S. is trying to keep a nation from getting its independence for fear that they would turn communist, and it would have this domino effect of all the other nations in Southeast Asia would go communist as well. So here's an example of the Cold War in the Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong, the northern communist Vietnamese were being funded by the Russians and the Chinese. Example of a proxy war where the U.S. actually jumped in and took one side. I mentioned the Korean War. These things happened all over the place, in Hungary, in Prague. U.S. aiding one side, the Soviets aiding another side in this struggle. In terms of the independence movements, the podcast has an enormous amount of information. I can't tell you how important the podcast is this time, and since you're here watching, I'm going to tell you the next LEQ you write from my class will come from the third podcast that I have listed. So listen to the podcast very carefully. Here's what you should look for, and it goes with these topics very well. You need to know examples of independence movements. And in the topic pages, it says you need to know an example of a negotiated independence and a violent war for independence. And I give details in the podcast about Indian independence, led by Gandhi until his assassination, and the settler colony in North Africa, the French settler colony of Algeria. So look, that's an example of a violent one. And the way this goes, in the developments here where it says some colonies negotiated their independence, some colonies fought for their independence, you just need to know one example of each of those, because that means that could be a question or an essay prompt on the AP test. So the podcast just gives that to you, all right? This gives it to you. You need to know India as a negotiated independence with the British and the violent, ongoing, bloody revolution in Algeria. And I just talked about Vietnam a little bit as well. They fought for their independence too. So it also fulfills that idea of a violent revolution. So you need to know about Indian independence, Algerian independence. And then you need to know about changes in the structure of the global economy, or the global politics. And let's just stop for a second, because this is pretty important, and look at the 20th century. It began with empires. You had World War I. Two empires did not survive it. The two major empires did not survive it. The Russian and the Ottoman empires did not survive it. The British held on. The French held on. So there's a change in the global structure of political power. Then you have World War II, which ends those empires and leaves two powers standing, the U.S. and the Soviets. And you have this bipolar world dominated by two nuclear-armed nations that have as their goal to create spheres of influence in the world that are just like them. So that's quite a dramatic change in just 100 years in the patterns of global politics. And then in 1991-92, the Soviet Union fell and the Cold War ended. So that bipolar world is dealt with in the podcast. And lastly, you need to know examples of some leaders who gave their nations new economic independence and kind of stood up. You need to know examples of some nations that stood up to both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. These are called non-aligned nations. So they didn't want to align with the Russians or the Americans. And Egypt is a great example. By the India is too. Gandhi refused to take sides in the Cold War. But Egypt's a great example. They nationalized their economy, and the leader here is Gamal Nasser, and I mentioned him in the podcast. That's one of the illustrative examples in these topic sheets. So from here, I'm just going to point you to that podcast. There's nothing in the podcast that's not relevant, so please listen carefully, and I would take notes. You could use that podcast to annotate many places in these topic descriptions. So what we'll move to next week is I want to take a closer look at Vietnam and the French colonial struggle in the U.S. there, and then we'll look at the fall of the Cold War, and then we'll move on to globalization. And the end is really in sight. We're post-World War II now, so the content, I think we'll be done with content by the time you leave for spring break. So anyway, that is today's video. So I'll see you next time.